The morning the bay stallion went under the hammer, the rain had stopped just long enough for the yard at Harrow Cross to fill, and Eleanor stood at the rail in a black gown turned gray at the cuffs, and watched the only living thing her husband had loved be sold to settle his debts. The auctioneer called the horse a fine specimen, sound in wind and limb, the late Lord Carrow's own hunter, and the crowd of farmers and dealers and idle gentlemen pressed closer to the rope. She kept her chin level. She had learned to keep her chin level the way other women learned to embroider, as a thing the body did, without being told. A man near the gate said loud enough to Carrie that the widow had nothing left to sell but the beast and the rings on her fingers, and that the rings would go next. Eleanor did not turn her head. The bay stamped once in the churned mud, ears flat, and looked for the hand that used to come over the door of his box with an apple cupped in it. And that hand was 8 months in the ground. If you have ever stood in a public place and felt the whole of it decide what you are, stay with me, because this is a story about a woman the world had finished with, and a man who had not. She had married Thomas Carrow at 19 and buried him at 25, and in between there had been a great deal of laughter and not nearly enough money, and the debts she discovered after the funeral were larger and older than the marriage itself. The estate was entailed away to a cousin, who arrived within the fortnight, with a surveyor and a list. The horses were hers, the solicitor had said the one unmortgaged thing, and so the horses were sold. The carriage pair first, then the hack she rode. And now the bay, who was the last and the best, and the one Thomas had ridden the day he was thrown on the Marley Road and carried home with his neck broken. She had sworn she would not weep at the rail. She did not. She watched the bidding climb, and thought of the apple, and of the way the horse had screamed in his box for 3 nights after they brought the body in, as though he too were trying to settle an account no one would let him pay. The bidding stalled at 40 guineas. 40 guineas for a horse worth 200, because the dealers knew a forced sale when they smelled one, and a widow at the rail could not bid against them with money she did not have. The auctioneer lifted his gavel. Eleanor closed her gloved hand around the top rail until the seam of the glove bit her palm, and she made herself look at the bay's dark eye, and she promised him silently that wherever he went, she would think of him in the mornings, which was the only promise left in her gift. Then a voice from the back of the yard said one word, and the word was enough. 200. The crowd turned as one animal turns. A man had come through the gate without anyone marking it, tall, in a dark blue riding coat, cut close and travel-stained. At the hem, his boots, gray with the road, and he did not raise his hand or his voice again. He only stood with the rainlight on the hard plane of his jaw and waited while the auctioneer found his tongue. The dealers looked at one another. 200 guineas ended the matter as a candle ends a draught. Eleanor looked at the stranger, and did not know him. And something in her chest did a thing she had told it never to do again, which was hope, and she crushed it before it could cost her. His name, she would learn within the hour, was Julian Ashby, the Duke of Wexbury, and he had ridden 11 miles in the wet to buy a horse. He had no need of, and no one in the yard could say why. The auctioneer's clerk brought the papers to a plank table beneath the eave of the stable, and the Duke signed without sitting, and counted out the sum in notes from a flat leather case, and the bay was led to him on a frayed halter by a boy too frightened of the rank to look up. Eleanor turned to go. She had no place at the conclusion of a sale that was the dismantling of her life, and she had a long walk back to the 2 rooms she now rented above the chandler's in the village, and she did not wish anyone to see how the walk would be taken. She had gone perhaps 10 steps along the wet flags when the Duke spoke again, not loudly, the words level as a ruled line. "Madam, a moment." She stopped, because rank stops a person whether they will it or not. She turned. He had the halter rope in one hand, and the bay's nose was already at his shoulder, lipping at the wool of his coat in the way the horse did to people he had decided to trust, which was not many, and the sight of it undid something at the back of her throat. The Duke watched her face do the thing it was doing, and gave no sign of having seen it. "This is Lord Caro's hunter," he said. It was not a question. "He was," Eleanor said. "He is yours now, your grace. I hope he serves you." "You are Lady Caro." "I am Eleanor Caro." The title went with the estate, to my husband's cousin. "I am told I am Mrs. Caro now, or only Eleanor, depending on who is unkind." She had not meant to say so much. She pressed her lips together. The Duke regarded her with grey eyes that gave nothing back, and the rain began again very lightly, beating on the shoulders of his coat, and he did not move to shelter. And neither, therefore, could she. "The horse knows you," he said. "He knew my husband. I am only what is left of the smell of the house." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The country a smile is exiled from. He looked at the bay, and at her, and he seemed to be performing a calculation she could not see the figures of. Then he inclined his head the precise degree her former station would have earned, and led the stallion away through the gate, mounting in the road with the unconscious ease of a man who had spent more of his life on a horse than off one. And the bay went under him without a quarrel, and they were gone up the Marley Road into the grey. And Eleanor stood in the yard until the cold came through the thin soles of her shoes, and reminded her she was a person who had somewhere to be, even if the somewhere was small. She told herself she would never see him again. She was wrong about that, as she was wrong about a great many things in those months, because grief had taught her to expect only subtraction. The village of Netherharrow had decided about Eleanor before she finished unpacking the single trunk the cousin had let her keep. The chandler's wife, Mrs. Menon Pell, was kind in the manner of a woman who enjoyed being kind to someone, clearly beneath the reach of envy, and she gave Eleanor the 2 rooms at a rent that was charity dressed as commerce, and she told the other women of the village that the poor creature had married above herself and been left with nothing, which was true, and that she gave herself heirs, which was not, and both halves traveled equally far. Eleanor took in fine sewing. She had a hand for it, taught by a French governess in the years before. Her father's own affairs collapsed and sent her to the marriage market as a beauty without a portion, and she turned collars and let out seams and embroidered christening gowns for women who paid her in coin and condescension in roughly equal measure. She was 25 years old. She had been told in the 8 months since the funeral, in a dozen rooms by a dozen mouths, that her life was effectively concluded, that a widow without money and without children was a closed book, and she had begun, in the worst hours, to believe it. What none of them knew, what she had told no one, was the second debt, the private one. There was a family at the edge of the parish, the Sowerbys, a labourer and his wife, and 4 children, and the labourer had been hurt in Thomas's service and turned off without a penny by the cousin who inherited, and Eleanor, who had nothing, had been quietly giving them a portion of her sewing money every week since the autumn, because the man had been hurt mending a wall that kept her late husband's deer in, and she could not carry the weight of a household that had used him so, and then discarded him. She did it in secret. Charity from the poor to the poorer was a thing the village would have found either ridiculous or suspect, and she had no appetite for being either. It was 3 weeks after the auction that she saw the bay again. She was walking the lane behind the church with a finished gown wrapped in linen against her chest when she heard hooves and stepped to the verge, and the stallion came around the bend at a collected trot with the Duke of Wexbury on his back, and the horse saw her and checked so hard the Duke had to sit deep against the halt. The bay turned his great head and reached for her, and she put up her free hand without thinking, and laid it on the velvet of his nose, and for a moment the lane held only the sound of the horse breathing into her palm. "He does that," the Duke said from above her, "for no one but you. I have tried apples, I have tried sugar. He takes them and turns his back. He is loyal to a smell, your grace not to me." But her hand stayed on the horse's nose, and she did not look up, because she could feel her own pulse in her wrist where it pressed the warm muzzle, and she did not want him to see it. Loyalty is not so easily explained as a smell. He dismounted. He did it on the offside to keep the horse between them, which a less observant woman would have read as carelessness, and which Eleanor, who had ridden since she was 4, read as courtesy, a way of not looming over a woman alone in a lane. He stood with one hand on the rein and looked at the linen-wrapped bundle against her chest. "You are cold," he said. It was the flattest possible statement of fact, and underneath it, like a stone under still water, was something that was not flat at all. The church porch is dry. Wait there until the rain passes. It was not raining. The sky was the color of pewter, but the rain had held off for an hour. She understood that he had given her an order she could obey without shame. A roof she could stand under that cost her nothing, and that the rain he named was a courtesy too, a fiction that let her rest without being a woman who needed rest given to her. She went to the porch. He waited in the lane with the horse until she was under the stone arch, and then he mounted and rode on, and he had not asked her a single question about herself, and she found, walking home, that she was turning the moment over and over the way the tongue returns to a chipped tooth. To the village she was the widow Caro, who had been somebody and was now nobody. And the second voicing of it came from Mrs. Pell's own sister, visiting from Marleigh, in the shop below Eleanor's rooms, where every word climbed the stair, as if it had been built for the purpose. That is her, the one who sold the horse. Poor thing, she clings to the gentry as though they would have her back. A widow with debts and a needle. There is nothing sadder than a woman who has forgotten what she is. Eleanor sat very still on the edge of her narrow bed, with a half-hemmed cuff in her lap, and let the words go through her. And she thought, with the small grim humor that was the only armor left to her, that the woman was wrong on the particulars and right on the shape, because she had not forgotten what she was. She remembered it every morning. The forgetting would have been a mercy. The Duke of Wexbury, she learned in pieces, the way one learns of any great man in a small place, had come to the district to take possession of Thornley, the seat that bordered the Marleigh Road, which he had inherited 18 months before from an uncle he had not spoken to in a decade. He kept no London house open. He gave no balls. He had a steward and a small staff and a stable he was filling slowly with horses chosen for use, and not for show. And the country families, scenting an unmarried duke of 32 with 40,000 a year, had begun the long siege of dinner invitations, and he had declined nearly all of them. And the one he had not declined was the assembly at Marleigh, where every family of consequence within 20 miles would be, because his steward had told him plainly that a duke who never showed his face bred a worse gossip than one who showed it once. Eleanor knew about the assembly because the woman it was being held to display, in a sense, was a frequent customer. Miss Augusta Finch, niece to the Dowager, Lady Marleigh, was the acknowledged diamond of the district, 19 and gold-haired and possessed of a settlement that made her the obvious solution to the problem of a duke and her aunt. The Dowager had organized the assembly around her the way a general organizes a field around his cannon. Augusta brought her gowns to Eleanor to be altered, because Eleanor's stitching was the finest to be had short of London, and she stood in the center of the little room being pinned and talked of the Duke as though he were a property already surveyed. And Eleanor knelt at her hem with pins in her mouth and said nothing, and the Dowager, who sometimes came, looked at the kneeling widow with the mild interest of a woman inspecting a chair, and once said to her niece, not lowering her voice because the kneeling woman was furniture, that it was a charity to give the creature work, since she was clearly born for better and fit for nothing. That should have been the whole of it. A widow on her knees, and a diamond at her toilette, and a dowager arranging the world. Yet the Duke of Wexbury had a wound, and the wound was about to become the hinge on which everything turned, and Eleanor was the only person in 3 counties who would be given the truth of it, and she would be given it by accident, in a stable, in the cold, with her hands full of a sick horse's head. It happened because the bay fell ill. A groom from Thornley came running to the chandler's on a Sunday, sent by the steward who remembered that the widow had a way with the horse, and Eleanor went without taking off her apron, because some debts are paid before they are reasoned about. And she found the stallion down in his box with the colic, sweating and trying to roll. and 3 frightened grooms, and a duke in his shirt-sleeves, on his knees in the straw, holding the great head out of the muck and getting nowhere, because the horse would not be still for any of them. "Get him up," Elinor said, and she did not say, "Your Grace," and no one noticed that she had not, because she had taken command of the box the way a current takes a leaf. "He will twist his gut if he rolls. Walk him now." And they walked him. For 4 hours through the night, in the lantern-lit yard, the widow and the duke, and the grooms in shifts, and it was Elinor at the head the whole while, talking to the bay in a low, steady voice that Thomas had used, and that she had absorbed without knowing it. And somewhere past 2 in the morning, the horse passed what was blocking him and stood with his sides heaving and his nose pressed into her shoulder, and she leaned her forehead against the wet neck and let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the auction. The grooms went to their beds. The duke did not. He stood in the lantern light in his ruined shirt with straw in his dark hair, and looked at the woman who had saved his horse, and the careful distance he had kept in the lane was gone, burned off by the long night the way fog burns off a field. He went to the wall of the box, and took down a thing that hung there on a nail, half hidden behind the rack, and he held it out to her in the flat of his hand, and it was a small framed miniature. A portrait the size of a watch of a young man laughing, fair where the duke was, dark perhaps 20. "My brother," he said, "Henry. He broke his neck on a horse I bred and gave him 4 years ago on the Thornley Downs, against my advice, because I told him the horse was green, and he laughed at me and took it over a wall. It was not ready, for I was the better rider. I should have ridden it first. I did not." He looked at the miniature and not at her. "I have not been able to look at a horse since without seeing the moment I did not stop him. When I heard that Caro had died the same way, thrown, his neck, his own good horse standing over him, I could not let the animal go to a dealer to be ridden hard, and sold on, and end in a knacker's yard. It was not sense. My steward thinks I have run mad." He returned the miniature to its nail with a care that told her the box was not a hiding place, but a shrine. "I tell you this," he said, "because you walked my brother's death for 4 hours tonight and did not flinch, and I find I would rather you knew the truth than thought me a man who buys horses for sport." Elinor stood with her heart going hard against her stays and understood, in the way the body understands before the mind consents, that the cold composed man before her had bought the bay for the same reason she had wept for it, that they were 2 people, carrying the same shape of grief from opposite ends, and she said the only thing that was true: "You did not kill your brother, your Grace. A wall did, and his own joy. I have spent 8 months learning that the dead do not lend us their guilt to wear. We put it on ourselves, because it is the only thing of theirs we can still hold." He looked at her then for a long moment in which neither of them breathed, and the lantern guttered, the bay shifted his weight and sighed, and the duke said, very low, "Eat something before you walk home. I will not have you fainting in the road. There is bread and meat in the kitchen, and Mrs. Bread. Hale will give you a basket for the Sowerbys, who I understand you have been keeping these 4 months on a seamstress's wages, while the village calls you proud." She had told no one of the Sowerbys. She stared at him. "My steward keeps accounts," he said, "of who is hungry in my parish and who is not, and why a laborer hurt in Caro's service, turned off by the cousin, fed all winter by Caro's widow out of money she does not have. I had thought to ask you how a woman with nothing manages it. I find I no longer need to ask." He turned away to bank the lantern, and over his shoulder, in the flat voice that she had learned to read the underside of, he said, "Go and eat, Elinor." It was the first time he had used her name. She heard it land. She felt it the way one feels the first warmth after frostbite, which is not comfort, but the pain. That means the part of you is still alive, and she went to the kitchen and ate, and carried the basket home through the last dark before dawn, and did not sleep, and could not have said whether what she felt was joy or terror, because in her experience the 2 had always arrived in the same carriage. The assembly at Marlay was held a fortnight later, and Eleanor was there, though not as a guest. The Dowager Lady Marlay had commissioned a gown for her niece so elaborate that it required attendance, a seamstress in the retiring room to mend a torn flounce or pin a slipped sleeve through the long night, and Eleanor was paid a half-crown to sit among the cloaks and shawls and wait to be needed. She wore her best black, which was her only black, and she sat in the corner of the warm, crowded retiring room and listened to the music come muffled through the wall, and told herself she did not mind. And mostly she did not, until Augusta swept in glittering at the height of the evening to have a pin reset and announce to the room of attending ladies, 20 in the carrying voice of a girl who has never once been told to be quiet, that the Duke of Wexbury had danced with her twice, and that her aunt expected an offer before the season's end. "He is very cold," Augusta said happily, while Eleanor pinned. "But they are all cold until they are caught, and Aunt says a cold husband is the most comfortable kind. He scarcely speaks." He looked at me the whole of the second dance, as though he were counting something. She laughed. "I shall have Thornley redone entirely. It is full of the dreariest old horses, and not one decent ballroom." Eleanor set the pin. Her hands did not shake, which she counted afterward as the one mercy of the evening. It was past 11 when the Dowager herself came into the retiring room, not for a pin, but for the widow. She closed the door. She was a handsome woman of 60 in gray silk and the Marlay diamonds, and she had the gift common to her kind of making a small room feel like a court. And she looked at Eleanor as she had looked at her kneeling at the hem, with mild proprietary interest, and she said what she had come to say without preamble. "You will stop," the Dowager said. "Whatever it is you imagine is happening. He bought your horse, and he fed your pauper, and the parish has begun to talk, and I will not have my niece's match clouded by a seamstress with a sad face and a clever needle. I know your sort. You have nothing, and nothing makes a woman dangerous, because she has nothing to lose by reaching above her. You will not reach. You are the Widow Carroll, with your debts and your needle, and that is the whole of what you are, and a duke does not marry the whole of what you are. Do you understand me?" There it was, the third time, in a closed room from the most formidable woman in the district, the verdict pronounced as if it were weather. Eleanor stood and folded her hands and looked at the Dowager with gray blue eyes that had wept themselves dry months before, and had nothing left in them now but the truth. And she said, "I understand you perfectly, my lady. I have understood you since the auction. I have not reached for anything. I have buried a husband, and fed a hungry child, and sewn your niece's gown, and if those are the acts of a dangerous woman, then the word has lost its meaning." She picked up her work-basket. "I will not stop feeding the Sowerbys. The rest was never mine to start or stop. Good night, my lady." She walked home alone in the dark. She did not cry. She had, she thought, at last passed beyond the country where crying lived. And what she did not know walking the black lane with the cold coming through her shoes was that her quiet refusal had been heard through the thin door by a footman who carried it to the kitchen, where it became the tale of how the Widow Carroll had faced down the Dowager and not given an inch, and the tale traveled, the way the other tales had traveled. But this one traveled differently, because it was true, and it was brave, and even unkind. People are moved by courage when they are not its target. The dark moment came 3 days later, and it came dressed as the law. The cousin who had inherited Thomas's estate, a thin, avaricious man named Mr. Fore. Roderick Carow had discovered that the bay stallion had fetched 200 guineas at auction, and he had taken legal advice, and the legal advice was wrong but expensive, and he sent a writ to Eleanor claiming that the horse had been entailed property wrongly sold, that the 200 guineas were his, and that since she had already spent or given away what little she had, she would go to the debtor's prison at Marley in default. It was a lie, built on a misreading of the entail, but it was a lie with a seal on it, and a widow with no money, cannot fight a seal. And the constable came to the Chandlers on a grey morning, with the writ in his hand and Mrs. Prial, Pell weeping on the stair, and the whole village gathered in the street to watch the widow Caro taken up for debt, and the Dowager Lady Marleigh's carriage was among those that slowed to see. Eleanor came down the stair in her black gown with her chin level. She had packed a small bundle. She had written a note to the Sowerbys with the last of her money folded inside it, asking the constable to deliver it, and he had agreed, being not an unkind man, only a man with a seal to serve. She stepped into the street, and the village looked at her, and she looked back at them with no plea in her face, because she had learned that pleading only fed the watchers, and she said to the constable that she was ready, and at that moment, up the Marley Road came the sound of a horse ridden hard. The bay came into the village at a gallop, and was hauled to a sliding halt in the mud not 10 feet from the constable, and the Duke of Wexbury came off his back before the horse had fully stopped, and he had a paper in his hand too, and his face, which the district had only ever seen composed, was not composed now. He had ridden the 11 miles in something under the hour. The horse was black with sweat. He did not look at the crowd. He walked to the constable and put his own paper into the man's hand over the top of the writ, and the village held its breath, and the Duke read the Dowager's carriage, and Augusta's pale face, and Mr. Core, Taddo lurking near the shop with the satisfaction draining out of him, and he turned so that the whole street could hear him, and he said the thing he had ridden 11 miles to say, and he said it once. This woman is under my protection as my promised wife. The street made a sound like a held breath let go. The Dowager's gloved hand rose to the diamonds at her throat, and stopped there. And Augusta sat down rather suddenly on the seat of the carriage, as though her legs had been removed. Mr. Caro opened his mouth, and the Duke turned the grey of his eyes on him, and the mouth closed. The paper in the constable's hand was a sworn opinion from the Duke's own solicitor in London, dated and sealed, establishing that the horses had been the sole unentailed property of the late Lord Caro's widow, lawfully hers to sell, the proceeds lawfully hers to spend, and that any action to the contrary was without foundation, and would be met with the full weight of the Wexbury interest, which in that county was a great weight indeed. The constable read it twice. He folded the writ along its old creases, and handed it back to Mr. Breeze. Caro, with the particular contempt a working man reserves for a gentleman who has wasted his morning, and he touched his hat to Eleanor, and he said she was free to go, and that he was glad of it, and several people in the crowd said the same, and meant it. Eleanor stood in the mud with her small bundle in her hands, and looked at the Duke of Wexbury, and the 8 months of holding her chin level all at once cost more than she could pay, and her face came apart, quietly, the way ice gives on a pond, and he crossed the last of the distance between them, and did not touch her, because the street was watching and he would not make a spectacle of her grief. But he stood close enough that she could lean if she chose, and after a moment she chose, and put her forehead against the cold wet shoulder of his coat, exactly as she had leaned against the horse, and he stood very still and let her, his hand coming up at last to rest light as a settling bird at the back of her head. "You," said promised wife. She said into his coat low, so that only he could hear. "You never asked me. I am aware," he said. "I am asking now. I asked the solicitor first, because the law moves slowly, and a heart should not have to wait on it. Marry me, Eleanor. Not because I bought your horse. Because you walked my brother's death for 4 hours, and did not flinch. And because I have spent 2 years unable to look at a horse, and 3 weeks ago a woman put her hand on the bay's nose in a lane, and I found I could look at him after all. You gave me back the thing I lost. I am a man who pays his debts." The corner of his mouth did the thing that was not quite a smile, and this time he let it finish. "Also, I find I cannot stop thinking of you, which my steward tells me is the conventional reason, and I had thought myself above it, and I was wrong." She laughed. It came out broken and astonished and entirely real, the first laugh in 8 months, and the crowd heard it, and the crowd which had come to watch a widow taken to prison found itself instead watching a widow choose, and they did not begrudge her the choosing. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you. Impossible man, take me out of this street." He put her up on the bay before her, the way a man does when he means to keep both arms around what he is carrying, and the village of Nether Harrow watched the Duke of Wexbury ride out the way he had come with the widow Caro before him on her late husband's horse. And the Dowager Lady Marley sat in her carriage, and was, for the first time in her long life, entirely without a thing to say. And Augusta, who was 19 and not unkind, only untaught, watched them go, and felt the first true thing she had felt all season, which was that no one had ever once looked at her the way the Duke had looked at the seamstress, and that perhaps a settlement was not the whole of what a person should want. They were married in the small church at Thornley 6 weeks later, with the Sowerbys in the second pew in new clothes, the laborer mended enough to stand, and his eldest girl strewing the path with the last of the autumn roses. There was no crowd. Eleanor had asked for no crowd. She had had enough of being watched to last her the rest of her life. And the rest of her life, it turned out, was going to be long and quiet and full. The first hard frost came in November, and on the morning of it Eleanor walked down to the stables at Thornley in a warm green gown that fit her and gloves that were whole at every finger. And she carried an apple in her cupped hand, and the bay put his head over the door of his box, and took it and did not turn his back. Because she was no longer only the smell of a dead house to him. She was the hand that walked beside him in the worst night of his life. And a horse, like a duke, knows the difference between a smell and a person, given time. Julian found her there, as he often found her there in the mornings, her cheek against the warm neck and her breath showing in the cold. And on the wall of the box behind her hung the small miniature of a laughing fair young man, brought down at last from its hiding place, and set where the morning light could reach it. Because the Duke of Wexbury had discovered that grief kept in the dark only ever grew, and grief brought into the light beside an apple. And a wife, and a horse that lived, became something a man could carry without breaking under it. He stood in the doorway and watched his wife feed his brother's memory and his brother's manner of death, made gentle, and he did not say anything because some things do not require it, and the frost made the whole yard shine. If Eleanor's story stayed with you, and if you believe, as she came to believe, that the world's first verdict on a person is rarely its last, I am glad you stayed to the end. Thank you for that. Outside the box, the sun came up over the Thornley Downs and laid itself along the frost. And inside it, a woman the world had finished with stood in the warm dark with her hand on a living thing, and was at the very last and for the first time in a long time exactly where she belonged.